Hello friends, welcome back. Hope you've had a great week. We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 3 today. And for this week, I'm going to take you on a journey through parts of the Old Testament. We sometimes forget how strong some of those admonitions were against idolatry, which will come up in chapter 3. For example, if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, we see Moses preparing the Israelites to enter the Promised Land. And one of his strongest admonitions is against idolatry. If you remember, when God gave the 10 Commandments, the people saw fire, smoke, the darkness of God's presence, but they saw no form. And the admonition was never worship a form. Don't give God a form. Never worship the sun, moon, stars, statues made by human hands. God has no form that we should be worshiping. As a part of idolatry also is don't pursue other gods, because God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. Those were words that Moses used in Deuteronomy. And then he warned them, if the Israelites fell into idolatry, God would drive them from the land into lands where idolatry was the order of the day. And guess where we are in the book of Daniel? We are in a faraway land where the Israelites were driven because of idolatry. Another helpful passage for us in looking at idolatry in those early days is Isaiah 44. 15 through 17, where it discusses the absurdity of making idols. Then he uses part of the wood to make a fire. With it, he warms himself and bakes his bread. Then, yes, it's true, he takes the rest of it and makes himself a god to worship. He makes an idol and bows down in front of it. He burns part of the tree to roast his meat, and to keep himself warm, he said, that fire feels good. Then he takes what's left and makes his god, a carved idol. He falls down in front of it, worshiping and praying to it. Rescue me, he says. You are my God. Daniel 3 verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And do you remember that gold-headed statue that we heard about in the dream back in chapter 2? Well, it looks like Nebuchadnezzar, once he was confident that his reign would not be crushed by this rock, instead of just having a statue with a head of gold, why don't we just have an entire gold statue? Remember, we talked about how the fact statues in those days were not very uncommon. And so it would be expected to see this huge statue, and crazy huge, 90 feet tall. It just towered, if you can visualize how tall that is, it just towered over the plain of Dura. Probably was a worship site. We set the statue up, and it compared with some other ancient statues. For example, Colossus at Rhodes is 107 feet tall, but it has odd dimensions. 9 feet wide. It's a tall, thin figure, perhaps more of a tower with a statue on top. We're not sure. Or maybe those dimensions were an exaggeration by our author of the book of Daniel as something abnormal and kind of grotesque. That's a possibility too. Probably was gold-plated, not made of solid gold. So let's take a look at Daniel chapter 3, verse 2 and 3. Then, this King Nebuchadnezzar, then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So, all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So we see a great deal of obedience from his provincial officials. And there is a bit of humor in this long list where we get all of these officials listed. And by the time you go through the whole list, you almost get the giggles. But let's go on. Daniel 3, 4 through 6. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So here's the command. When you hear the music, bow to the ground. And this didn't mean just bow. This probably meant flat on the ground. And again, we see a little bit of this humor with all the instruments listed. We'll see that again. When our kids were young, I read the book of Daniel to them. And I didn't really realize the humor in these long lists that will come up again and again. And I am quite certain that the author of the book of Daniel intended for this to be humorous. It's actually to mock the king and the officials and what was going on with all this. Another interesting piece is when you hear the music, drop flat on your face. It's kind of a Pavlov dog effect. It's not what I would think of as worship, but it's what King Nebuchadnezzar demanded. Certainly we see the worship of the statue was an indication of political unity and loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar. Everyone is summoned, everyone comes. If you remember, we have talked some about God, Yahweh, the true God, being the God of the whole world. Well, here Nebuchadnezzar is actually calling himself God of the whole world, of all the people. But let's keep moving. Daniel 3, verse 7. So, at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. We see this unthinking, blind following. I'm certainly not being critical of the people. They had no interest in being thrown into this fiery furnace. I don't think we would either. All the people bowed down indicates the influence of the king. We see that power. Daniel 3, 8 through 15. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." We see the astrologers here with some ethnic prejudice and professional jealousy as they refer to some Jews. Kind of gives away what their opinion is of these three Jews who are in charge of the entire province of Babylon. They're saying the three of them are guilty of treason. Well, let's go on with verse 13 then. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" So we see Nebuchadnezzar is furious. Now it is interesting, he gave them one more chance. But he said, "Do you refuse to serve my gods and worship my statue?" In Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he probably thought, "I have accepted your God. Why can't you accept mine?" For many peoples in ancient times, the idea of monotheism, one God, was foreign to them. They worshipped many gods. And Nebuchadnezzar here said, I've accepted your gods. Why can't you accept mine? And you're disobeying my direct command. So he accused them of treason and of disobedience. He does give them a chance. He asked them, is it true? Is this what you have done? And then he gives the three men a second chance. Next time you hear the music, will you bow down? And then he says, what God will rescue you? If you won't worship all of my gods, there really isn't a God left, is there? Because I worship all of the gods. What an interesting statement for him to make. Nebuchadnezzar elevated himself above any other god with these claims. He saw himself as absolutely supreme. Well, let's continue our story. Daniel 3, 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." There's no discussion. There's no second chance for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They will not serve Nebuchadnezzar's gods. They don't even need to defend themselves. But they do identify there is a God who could rescue them. A God more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar. And we're getting now to kind of the core of this chapter again. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego make an amazing claim too. Even if God does not deliver them, they will not bow down to this silly statue. They are faithful to the first two commandments. Worship no other God, and no bowing down before graven images. That comes from Exodus. So they make their choice. They are faithful in response to God's grace given a long time ago to them and to their ancestors. There's no question in their mind that they will not bow down to these false gods. If you remember where we started this lesson, looking at the reminder from Moses about no idolatry, these three young men had learned those lessons. There are no other gods. Do not worship these false gods. The other thing that they say, even if God doesn't deliver them, they are willing to do the right thing, even if it doesn't go their way, even if they don't make any difference, even if they can't see what God's going to do, they're going to do the right thing. And there's something that we can learn from this, of doing the right thing, even if we don't know if we're going to benefit from it. When we are motivated just to do the right thing because it stands on its own merit, then we're not motivated by positive or negative payoff. When we are in the desert and see no signs of God, it is grueling to do the right thing day in and day out just because it's right. This is called a truly ethical action when we are motivated by the intrinsic merit of the action, not by its positive or negative payoff. That's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were conveying to King Nebuchadnezzar. They were going to do the right thing, whether God rescued them or not. They would do the right thing. They gave allegiance to God, not for what he would or could do, but because it was right. That's a fabulous example of faithfulness to us. Daniel 3, starting at verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 10 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up, and they threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the three men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. The plot, the story just gets more intriguing at this point. The fact that the furnace was heated 7 times hotter may well be a hyperbole, but that 7 times is a fullness. It's a number for fullness or completion. And so it may mean this furnace was hot and ready. The point of that is the king and his furnace were as hot as they could possibly be. Both were out of control. That idea of this furnace takes us back to the Israelites living in Egypt centuries before. God had delivered the Israelites from these iron melting furnaces of the Egyptians. And he had brought them out of Egyptian bondage. So, there's hope here. And we will see, let's go on with our story. Starting at verse 24. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire, unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god." We'll stop there for just a minute. We have suddenly 4 men walking around in this furnace, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th one looks like a son of the gods. At least that's Nebuchadnezzar's interpretation. The narrator doesn't tell us anything about this 4th figure, this supernatural presence. Some of our Christian traditions tell us that perhaps this was the pre-incarnate Christ. Maybe this was Jesus before he was Jesus. Nebuchadnezzar would not have thought of this as God come in the flesh. He just saw some supernatural being who looked like the son of a god. The significance of this 4th figure doesn't depend on our exact identity of it. We could spend a lot of time trying to figure it out and lose track of our story. But we do know, because this is totally impossible to have happen, that God is the one delivering his servants from the king's hand. God is the one delivering his servants from the king's hand. So, let's continue on with our story. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. This is impossible. One of the things we see with Nebuchadnezzar at this point, when he calls out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he identifies them, servants of the Most High God. That's what he calls them. He recognizes that the Most High God has done something amazing here. So Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. We will go on in verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." So we see Nebuchadnezzar is impressed. He recognizes that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was able to deliver his people even from the king's power. And he is impressed with the faithfulness of these Jews who are willing to die for their God. So he adds the God of Israel into his group of gods. But he recognizes this God as the Most High God and the one who is able to deliver. I don't think he became monotheistic at this point. It would be very unusual for a king to do that, but he did see God as one of many and the Most High God. So he progressed to that point. And he recognized that God outranked him. which is a pretty amazing comment for him to make. Keep in mind, something we look at in the book of Daniel from the start is this contrast between kingdoms, between earthly kingdoms, Nebuchadnezzar in this case, and the kingdom of God. The power of Nebuchadnezzar versus the power of God. We continue to see that conflict, and we see God hitting home runs every time it comes up. So now Nebuchadnezzar proclaims that no one can speak against the Most High God, the God of heaven. Daniel chapter 3 turns on the speech of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which happens kind of in the middle of the book. If you're familiar with the term of a Jewish chiasm, this would be the center of the chiasm, which would be the point of the chapter. And I'll go back and read that for you again. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to rescue us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." This whole chapter turns on the speech that we read from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Really, the central message of the chapter is this admonition against idolatry in the first and second commandment. You shall have no other gods before you. You shall have no graven images. Nebuchadnezzar had spectacularly ignored both of those. But these young Jewish men were willing to face death rather than ignore those two commandments. And their steadfastness to their God is in contrast with this idol-making king whose subjects just bow in blind obedience. It's almost funny how they hear the music, flat to the ground. Idolatry was a major problem for the nation of Israel for most of its history. It was just an obsessive kind of sin that many of the people went through. From the time they went into the promised land with Moses, and really went into the promised land with Joshua. And they were told over and over, do not pursue the idols of the people around you. Choosing other gods, choosing other resources over God. Daniel takes place in the time of the exile. The people of Israel were sent into exile because of their idolatry. History shows us that after the time of the exile, when many Jews were allowed to return to their homeland, they no longer struggled with idolatry. Although the people of God, after the exile, were cured, if we could say that, with their infatuation with false idols, they and we continue to struggle with images and resources that could help or replace God. It's just a constant battle for us as humans. Jesus challenged his Jewish contemporaries in that first century because they had come up with a system that almost didn't need God. Remember, they didn't recognize God come in the flesh because we are so guilty of the same kind of thing. What are some of the gods today? Could be prestige. We want to be known. We want status. We want to make connections. It could be entertainment. We believe we have the right to rest and relax, be comfortable, be entertained. For some of us, it might be gluttony. Food takes a high place in our lives, and when we want to be comforted, we turn to food instead of to God in prayer, for some of us. It could be your self-image. You're constantly studying to figure out how to know yourself better. It's not wrong to know yourself better. Don't misunderstand me. But if that becomes more important to you than knowing God and God's view of you, be careful. Consumerism is the god of our country. We are consumed with consumerism, dare I say that? An entire industry has risen up since about the 1960s called storage units. And so now we pay quite a bit of money every month to store stuff in these little units that we don't use or need. I've been struck with how few people actually put their car in their garage because the garage is so full of stuff. We are all guilty of consumerism in this country. Do we let that replace God? You have to ask God to show you about that. None of these things are bad in themselves. They reflect human creativity. They can be wonderful tools that we can use in our world. They are God's gift to us. It is good for us to enjoy what God has made and to be satisfied with that, to get some joy in those kinds of things. Those things are not usually the problem. It's when we make them too much. Idolatry can lie within us, ever reaching for something more than God to fully satisfy us. That is a danger that we have yet today. One of the most pervasive idols is human autonomy, the right to do what we want, how we want, when we want, with whoever we want. If something makes us happy, we're entitled to it. If something makes us unhappy, we are entitled to get rid of it. Human autonomy is the God of gods, and we tend to worship it. We have to really be careful not even to save their skin, which Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego entertain the possibility of replacing God. How are we doing in that category? God told the faithful to expect trials. Sometimes we worship comfortable, normal, no challenges, no fears, which is really interesting right now with the world in chaos around us. Pandemics and riots, anger between neighbors. It's a confusing and chaotic time, and sometimes we think we're entitled not to have to suffer like this. But God says at times even His believers will suffer fiery trials. We certainly saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stay faithful to God even in the face of far harsher consequences than most of us will ever face. Let's take a look at 1 Peter 4:12. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through. Is there something strange or happening to you? Instead, be very glad. Hear that again. Be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in His suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing His glory when it is revealed to all the world. Reminder, friends, God stands in the flames with us. These days feel very rough and chaotic, but God stands here in these flames with us. The comfort for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was not just that God delivered them from the fire, but He stood in the fire with them. We are in the same place, friends. We are in chaotic times. We may not be in a fiery furnace, but sometimes it feels impossible, doesn't it? It feels like everything we have hoped for, everything we had planned on, may go up in smoke. But God stands in this chaos with us. We don't need to seek out idols. We can trust God to be with us. Isn't that great news? Thank you again for being with me. Next time, we're going to move into Daniel chapter 4. Have a wonderful week. Thank you for being here. God bless.